The psychiatric ward orderlies hauled me down the corridor like a discarded heap of trash, convinced I was nothing more than a heavily sedated addict and utterly oblivious to the fact that I was a federal auditor. My orthopedic walking boot had a micro-recording device sewn into the lining, actively transmitting to an FBI server 400 miles away. I realized exactly what kind of hell I had checked into at 11:45 p.m. on my first night, when the night shift locked the fire doors from the outside with heavy steel chains. I was 45, but with 3 days of scruff, fake track marks, and a convincing physical tremor, I looked like a broken man at the end of his rope. Whispering Pines Behavioral Center in rural Montana had billed Medicare for $4.2 million over 3 years. 6 former patients alleged they were kept heavily sedated and held until their insurance maxed out. No one believed a bunch of struggling young addicts. I volunteered for the assignment because my younger brother lost his life in a predatory facility, just like this one. By my second morning, I understood why none of the patients ever fought back. A terrified 19-year-old named Caleb asked to use the payphone to call his mother. A behavioral tech named Troy shoved him backward over a plastic chair. Caleb hit the linoleum hard. Troy casually stepped over him. Phone privileges are earned, junkie. Caleb curled into a ball and wept silently, terrified to make a sound. I logged the exact time on my hidden device. That afternoon, I listened as the clinical director, Dr. Owen Marsh, told a visiting state inspector the facility utilized groundbreaking holistic therapy with a 1-to-1 staff ratio. Meanwhile, we had been sitting in front of a static television for 7 hours with a single orderly sleeping at the security desk. On day 3, I faked a severe panic attack near the nurse's station. A nurse named Renee dragged me into a windowless observation room by the collar of my scrub shirt. She pulled a syringe, not the mild anti-anxiety medication on my intake sheet, but a massive dose of Haldol meant to turn patients into compliant zombies. I thrashed, palming an absorbent sponge pad under my sleeve to catch the liquid, then slumped to the floor, faking unconsciousness. "Enjoy the coma, you piece of trash," Renee muttered. "Bill his insurance for an emergency psychiatric intervention." Day 4 gave me the silver bullet. I was slumped in a wheelchair near the administrative offices, playing catatonic. Dr. Marsh stood in the doorway, ignoring the fact that I sat barely 3 feet away. "This guy's federal benefits max out in 3 days. Change his diagnosis to a severe schizophrenic episode. Keep him chemically restrained until Friday. Once the account hits 0, dump him at the Greyhound station in Billings. Bill for the daily group therapy sessions he missed while sedated." The transmitter captured every syllable in high definition. At 3:15 am on day 5, Troy and Renee hauled me out of bed and dragged me toward the loading dock. They were illegally dumping me early to clear a room. Renee opened the back doors of a rusted transport van. Instead of crawling inside, I planted my feet on the wet asphalt, stood up perfectly straight, and looked Troy dead in the eye. I reached down, unvelcroed my boot, and pulled out the blinking federal transmitter. "I'm canceling my checkout." Before Troy could raise his fists, floodlights exploded across the loading dock. 4 armored FBI tactical vehicles breached the front gates. Troy sprinted for the tree line and was tackled hard into the mud before he made 10 yards. Renee dropped to her knees, sobbing. I walked back inside as agents dragged Dr. Marsh out of his office in pajamas and handcuffs. He stared at my steady hand. "You're not an addict." "No," I replied, grabbing my jacket. "But you're a felon." The facility was permanently boarded up within the month. Marsh pleaded to a 20-year sentence. Renee and Troy caught 10 years each. Caleb was relocated to a genuine rehabilitation center in Colorado, where a real doctor finally handed him a phone so he could call his mom. I thought it was over. 6 weeks after the arrests, my supervisor called me into a conference room I didn't recognize. 2 people I had never seen sat at the table. No introductions. One of them slid a photograph across the surface. It was taken inside Whispering Pines, my 4th night, the windowless observation room where Renee had injected me. Except the angle was wrong, shot from above, through a ceiling panel I hadn't known existed. In the photo, I was clearly conscious. My sponge technique was clearly visible. "Someone else was watching you," my supervisor said quietly. "Someone who knew exactly who you were before you checked in." He tapped the photograph. The camera feed was broadcasting live to an encrypted external server. "We traced the IP this morning." He looked at me carefully. "It routes back to my brother's facility," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "The one that killed him." My supervisor didn't answer. He didn't have to. "We think," he said slowly, "that your brother's death wasn't an accident." The silence in the room became heavy, the kind that makes your ears ring. The 2 strangers didn't look at me. They looked at the laminated table surface. My supervisor, a guy named Miller, who had spent 22 years running regional fraud divisions and possessed the emotional range of a parking meter, finally sighed and pulled a manila folder from his leather briefcase. He didn't slide it over. He kept his hand flat on top of it. "The facility where your brother Julian died was called Hope Pathway," Miller said. His voice was too flat, too deliberate. 2 states away, in Oregon. Nominally, it was owned by a healthcare conglomerate called Vanguard Care System. When Julian passed away 18 months ago, the local coroner signed off on acute respiratory failure due to an accidental opioid interaction. Standard boilerplate for an overdose in a rehab. You accepted it because Julian had been struggling for 5 years, and the facility had a decent reputation on paper. "I accepted it because I was in the middle of a field operation in Chicago," I said. My knuckles were white against the edge of the table. I didn't have the bandwidth to doubt a state-certified medical examiner. But Marsh's operation in Montana wasn't Vanguard. It was registered under a shell corporation called Blue Ridge Limited. The woman sitting across from me finally spoke. Her name tag, pinned to a dark gray blazer, read Special Agent Arlo Farrow, OIG, Office of the Inspector General. She had sharp, restless eyes and a habit of clicking her pen without actually extending the nib. "Blue Ridge isn't a separate entity, Mr. Vance," she said. "It's a subsidiary. Vanguard Care Systems sold the physical property of Hope Pathway 3 months after your brother died, but they retained the intellectual property, the software, and the administrative backend. When Owen Marsh set up Whispering Pines, he didn't invent his billing system. He bought a turnkey franchise package from Vanguard, including the proprietary security network." She tapped the photo again. The hidden ceiling camera wasn't Marsh's security. It was pre-installed. It fed into a system that Marsh didn't even have the administrative passwords to access. He thought he was running his own private scam. In reality, he was a franchise manager for a larger network, and whoever owns the parent company was monitoring his facility to see exactly how our audit was playing out. "They watched me pretend to be sedated," I said, the cold realization settling into my stomach. "They watched me palm the sponge. They knew I was a plant on day 3, and they let it happen," Miller added, leaning forward. "They let us raid the place. They let Marsh, Renee, and Troy take the fall. Why? Because Marsh had become a liability. He was sloppy. His billing numbers were spiking too fast, drawing our attention. By letting us clear him out, they cut off a gangrenous limb before the infection reached the corporate office. But here's the problem, Jasper. The IP address that received the live transmission of your fake injection didn't just route to the old Hope Pathway servers. It was accessed by an active user terminal, registered to a private residence in Portland. He opened the folder and took out a single sheet of paper. It was a corporate registration document, signed in blue ink. The terminal belongs to a man named Dr. Stellan Ives, Farrow said. He was the chief medical officer at Hope Pathway when your brother was admitted. He's currently the regional director of clinical compliance for Vanguard Care Systems. He signed Julian's death certificate. I looked at the signature. It was a neat, precise script. The letters perfectly spaced, the kind of handwriting that belonged to a man who never rushed, who never panicked, a man who could watch a federal agent thrashing on a linoleum floor through a hidden camera and calmly decide to let the raid proceed. You're taking me off the field, I said. It wasn't a question. You're too close to it, Miller said. Your brother's history makes this a personal conflict of interest. The OIG is handling the corporate investigation into Vanguard. Your job is to return to the Denver office, draft the final post-operation report for Whispering Pines, and let Farrow do her work. I didn't argue. In my line of work, arguing with a supervisor when you're compromised is the fastest way to get your credentials suspended. I stood up, took my jacket from the back of the chair, and left the room without saying another word, but I didn't go back to Denver. 3 days later, I was sitting in a rented sedan parked across the street from a small, upscale medical park in Lake Oswego, an affluent suburb south of Portland. The rain was steady, a thin, gray drizzle that blurred the windshield and turned the asphalt into a dark mirror. According to the public directory, Dr. Stellan Ives maintained a private consulting office on the second floor of a restored brick building that smelled of damp bark and expensive espresso. I wasn't wearing my field gear. I had on a plain navy wool coat, regular jeans, and no transmitter. My orthopedic boot was gone, replaced by a standard leather shoe that felt strangely light on my left foot. I had spent 48 hours digging through old state medical board records using an old investigator account that Miller hadn't deactivated yet. Julian's intake records from Hope Pathway were sparse, but one detail had stuck in my throat. On the night he died, he hadn't been in his regular ward. He had been transferred to a private observation room because of unspecified behavioral escalation. The orderly on duty that night was a local contract worker who disappeared from the payroll a week later. The physician who ordered the transfer and who administered the final sedative was Ives. I waited until 4:45 p.m. The parking lot was emptying out. A silver crossover pulled into the reserved spot near the rear exit of the brick building. A man walked out, holding a black briefcase under a large umbrella. He was in his late 50s, with silver hair cropped close to his skull and a tailored charcoal overcoat that looked impervious to the Oregon damp. Stellan Ives. I didn't approach him in the parking lot. I didn't follow him home. Instead, I waited until he drove out of the lot, and then I pulled my sedan into the traffic 3 cars behind him. He didn't drive like a man who thought he was being watched. He didn't check his mirrors with any unusual frequency. He drove standard suburban speeds, stopping at a grocery store to buy a bottle of wine and a paper bag of groceries, then continued down a winding road lined with Douglas firs until he reached a mid-century modern home overlooking the river. I parked a block away near a public boat launch and walked back in the twilight. The air smelled of wet pine and wood smoke. Through the large glass windows of his living room, I could see Ives setting a table for one. He turned on a small lamp by a bookshelf, poured a glass of the wine he'd just bought, and sat down with a tablet. I walked up the stone path to his front door. I didn't have a warrant. I didn't have a badge that gave me authority in this state. I had my standard Treasury ID card and a pocket full of old state medical documents. I knocked 3 times, firm and even. The door opened after 20 seconds. Ives stood there, his glasses perched on the bridge of his nose, holding a linen napkin in his left hand. He looked at me with the mild, polite annoyance of a man interrupted during his dinner by a salesman. "Yeah," he said. "Dr. Ives," I said, keeping my voice level, the tone I used when I was verifying invoice discrepancies with hospital accountant. "My name is Jasper Vance. I'm an auditor with the Department of Health and Human Services." I held up my ID. He didn't flinch. He didn't look at the badge for more than a second. His eyes shifted directly to my face, studying the lines around my eyes, the shape of my jaw. The politeness didn't leave his expression, but something behind it clicked shut. It was the look of a man recognizing a specific model of machine he'd seen before. "Mr. Vance," he said softly. He didn't look back into his house. He didn't look around the dark port. "I believe your supervisor in Denver told you to take some administrative leave." The fact that he knew about Miller's instructions from 3 days ago felt like a physical slap. He hadn't just watched the feed from Whispering Pines. He had tabs on the internal division email. "Julian Vance was my brother," I said, ignoring his comment. "He died in your facility 18 months ago. You signed the certificate." Ives looked at the glass of wine on the small table inside his entryway, then back at me. He didn't seem frightened. He looked weary, the way doctors look when they have to explain a terminal diagnosis to a family member who is too angry to understand the medicine. "I remember Julian," Ives said. His voice was a dry baritone, very calm. He was 31. He had a severe, recurring valvular infection from his history of intravenous use. We treated him for 6 weeks. His heart was a ticking clock. "Mr. Vance, you must have known that." "He was clean for 22 days according to his chart," I said. "His toxic screen on admission was clear. His vitals were stabilizing. Then you moved him to a private room with no nurse's station visibility at 9 p.m. on a Tuesday. By midnight, he was gone." Ives adjusted his glasses. "Behavioral regression is common during the 3rd week of recovery. He became unmanageable. He attempted to leave the facility against medical advice while under the influence of a secondary psychosis. We had to chemically restrain him to prevent him from harming himself or the staff. His heart couldn't handle the stress of the event. It happens more often than you want to believe." "And the hidden camera in the ceiling at Whispering Pines?" I asked, my voice tightening. "The one routing to your private IP address here in Lake Oswego? The one that watched me palm a dose of Haldol from Renee? Was that also standard clinical compliant?" Ives didn't answer immediately. He reached out and slowly closed the door until there was only a 6-inch gap between us, his body blocking the warm light from the house. "Mr. Vance," he whispered, his face close to the screen door. "You did an excellent job in Montana. Owen Marsh was an idiot who thought he could use our billing software to fund a $3 million retirement in Costa Rica while letting his staff beat patients with plastic chairs. He was a brute. We let you have him because he was ruining the integrity of the data. But if you think your brother was a target, you're giving yourself too much credit. Julian was a patient who had a medical crisis in an overextended clinic. Nothing more. You're lying," I said. "You watched my intake. You watched my assignment from the day Miller filed the internal field request. I watch every facility that uses our administrative platform," I've said. "It's my job to ensure that when a facility fails, it fails cleanly, without involving the corporate board. Your brother's death was clean. It was investigated by the county. It was settled. If you keep looking into Vanguard, you aren't going to find a grand conspiracy to hurt federal auditors, Jasper. You're just going to find a very large corporation with very good lawyers who don't like being harassed by a grieving relative using a government badge he shouldn't be carrying." He started to close the door. "The orderly," I said quickly, my hand catching the frame. "The one who helped you move Julian to the private room. A guy named Bowen Trask. He left the state 48 hours after Julian's body went to the morgue. He didn't collect his final paycheck. Vanguard mailed it to a P.O. box in Boise. Why would an hourly tech leave 3 weeks of pay on the table if it was just a routine cardiac event?" event. Ives stopped. His hand stayed on the brass doorknob. For the first time, his eyes drifted away from mine, looking past my shoulder toward the dark river at the end of the street. His mouth thinned into a hard, straight line. "Good night, Miss Vance," he said. The lock clicked. The heavy oak door shut completely, leaving me standing on the porch in the rain, the sound of the river rushing through the dark below. I didn't go back to my hotel. I sat in the sedan for 3 hours, watching the lights in Ives' house go out one by one, until only the small lamp in his hallway remained. My phone buzzed in my pocket twice. It was Miller. I didn't answer. I knew what the text messages said without looking. He'd seen the login history on the Treasury server. He knew I was in Oregon. At 1:00 am, my personal email flagged an incoming message. No subject line, just an attached PDF file from a temporary, anonymous address. I opened it on my phone screen. It was an internal incident report from Hope Pathway, dated the night of Julian's death. It wasn't the official version filed with the state medical board. This one was typed on an old system template, marked with a red digital stamp that read, "Internal legal review only. Do not duplicate." The report stated that Julian hadn't suffered an accidental interaction. It said he had been given an injection of a compound called succinylcholine, a powerful paralytic used in surgical settings to paralyze muscles, including the diaphragm, after he allegedly discovered an administrative log showing that Hope Pathway was using patient identities to fill pharmacy prescriptions that were never delivered to the floor. The prescriptions were being rerouted to a private distributor in Washington state. According to the log, Julian had found the printout in the day room trash after a temp secretary dropped her folder. He told Caleb, the same Caleb who ended up at Whispering Pines a year later, that he was going to call our older sister to get a lawyer. The report was signed by Stellan Ives, but underneath his signature was a second note, written in ballpoint pen and scanned into the system. Patient became aware of inventory reconciliation codes. Situation managed under clinical safety protocol. Notify corporate legal regarding Trask's relocation expense. They hadn't just killed him because he was an addict whose insurance was running out. They had killed him because he'd looked into the garbage can and understood the numbers. And they had moved Caleb to Montana to keep him from talking to anyone who might ask questions about what happened that night in Oregon. The next morning, the sun didn't come out. It remained a pale, greasy yellow behind the clouds. I drove to a diner 2 miles from Ives' house, ordered a cup of black coffee that tasted like burnt leaves, and spread the printed PDF across the laminate table. The numbers on the pharmacy logs in the report matched the billing discrepancies I'd found at Whispering Pine. The exact same billing codes, 99214G for non-existent psychiatric evaluation, H0018 for fraudulent behavioral health residential services. It was the same machine. My phone rang. It wasn't Miller this time. It was an unknown number with a local Portland prefix. I picked it up. "Vance, Jasper," a voice said. It was low, raspy, and dry. Not Ives. It sounded like someone who had spent 30 years smoking cheap cigarettes in small rooms. "You were at Stellan's house last night." "Who is this?" "My name is Bowen Trask," the voice said. "I used to work the night shift at Hope Pathway. I'm the guy who didn't collect his paycheck." The coffee went cold in my throat. "Where are you, Bowen?" "I'm in an office park near the airport," he said. "A place called the Cascade Plaza. There's a corporate storage facility on the 3rd floor. Vanguard keeps their old hard copies here. The stuff they didn't want to upload to the cloud, because the cloud leaves an audit trail. Stellan called me last night after you left. He told me you had the incident report from Julian's night. He told me to clean out the remaining boxes from box 402 through 410 before the OIG agents show up with a subpoena next week." There was a long pause on the line. I could hear the sound of a heavy diesel truck passing in the background, then the high-pitched beep of a forklift reversing. "Why are you calling me, Bowen?" I asked. "If you're cleaning the boxes for them, you're part of it." "I was part of it until I found out what they did to the kid," Trask said. His voice cracked slightly, then hardened. "They told me Julian had a stroke. They told me he was dead before he hit the floor. I didn't see the syringe until Stellan was already putting it back in his leather case. I was just an orderly. Jasper, I made $17 an hour. I didn't want to go to prison for corporate fraud, so I took the 10 grand they offered to move to Idaho. But then I heard about Caleb. I heard they sent him to that meat grinder in Montana just to keep him under sedation so he wouldn't tell your family about the printout Julian found. Caleb is safe," I said. "He's in Colorado. He's talking to real doctors now. Then he's going to tell them about the pharmacy logs," Trask said. "And when he does, Stellan is going to put everything on me. He's going to say I administered the medication by mistake while he was out of the room. The paperwork from that night has my initials on the transfer sheet. I didn't sign the injection log, but my initials are on the room log at 9:15 p.m. If you have the boxes," I said, standing up and throwing a $5 bill onto the table, "stay there. Don't touch them. I can be at the airport in 20 minutes. "I'm not staying here," Trask said. "I'm loading them into a shredding bin in the basement corridor. If you want them, you better get here before the regional disposal truck arrives at 10:30. Stellan already paid the driver." The line went dead. I didn't call Miller. I didn't call Agent Farrow. If I called them, they would spend 40 minutes coordinating with the local field office, arguing over jurisdictions, and waiting for a supervisor's signature. By the time they arrived with a team, the boxes would be gray pulp in the back of an industrial recycling truck. I got into the sedan and hit the interstate, the wiper blades slapping against the glass as the rain picked up again. The airport corridor was a sprawling grid of gray concrete warehouses, logistics hubs, and air freight depots. Cascade Plaza was an older, 3-story professional building with mirrored windows that had turned green with moss around the ceiling. I parked near the loading dock at the rear. The glass doors of the lobby were unlocked, the carpet inside smelling of wet wool and industrial cleaner. A directory board showed Vanguard Care Systems, archives on the 3rd floor, suite 310. I took the stairs 3 at a time. My chest was tight, the old field training kicking in. Keep your hands loose, keep your eyes on the corners. Don't look like you're rushing if someone passes you in the hall. The 3rd floor was silent. The corridor was lined with cheap wood veneer doors. Suite 310 was at the very end, near the freight elevator. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open. The room was vast, filled with rows of steel shelving that went up to the 12-foot ceiling. Thousands of brown cardboard storage boxes, each marked with a black barcode sticker. The air was dry and smelled of old paper and dust. In the center row, 4 boxes were sitting on the floor, their tops torn off. A stack of paper, old medical charts, billing printouts with green and white lines, was piled next to an empty blue plastic bin. But there was no Bowen Trask. "Trask," I said, my voice muffled by the cardboard walls. A door at the back of the suite, a small utility room with a sink, creaked open. A man stepped out. He wasn't wearing an orderly's uniform. He was wearing a dark blue zip-up jacket, work boots, and grease-stained canvas pants. He was 60, with a thick gray beard and a red scar that ran from his ear down to his collarbone. He had a heavy roll of packing tape in his left hand. "Jasper?" "Yeah." He looked at my coat, then at my hand. "You Vance's brother?" "Yeah," I said. "Where are the rest of the files, Bowen?" Trask looked at the boxes on the floor, then down at the tape in his hand. He looked tired, the kind of tired that doesn't go away with a night's sleep. "Stellan's secretary secretary called the main office 10 minutes ago. They know I'm here. They canceled my access badge for the building elevator, but I'd already blocked the fire door with a wedge. He pointed to a stack of manila folders inside the blue bin. That's the Hope Pathway ledger from 2 years ago. It's got the names of the pharmacies we were using to run the dummy scripts. 3 of them don't even exist. They're just commercial mailboxes in Seattle. That's where the money was going. They were billing the government for psychiatric drugs for the patient, selling the actual pills to a broker in Seattle, and then billing the patient's insurance for specialized clinical monitoring to cover the time the kids spent sleeping off the sedatives they used instead. I reached down and picked up the top folder. The first page was an audit sheet from Vanguard Corporate. At the bottom, under the heading Risk Mitigation, there was a line that read, Patient Vance, J, discrepancy identified. Resolution complete. Resolution complete, I repeated. My voice sounded hollow in the empty room. Stellan did it himself, Trask said, leaning against a steel shelf. He told me to go take a smoke break by the loading dock. When I came back, the room was quiet. He was sitting at the desk, writing in the chart. He looked up at me and said, Julian had a reaction. Call the transport service. That was it. He didn't even look nervous. He just looked like he'd finished his paperwork for the day. We need to get these to the federal building downtown, I said, lifting the blue bin. It was heavy, 60 pounds of paper that represented 5 years of broken lives and a dead brother. Farrow has an active file. With this, she can get a warrant for the corporate office by tonight. We walked out of the suite toward the freight elevator. Trask hit the button, but the light stayed dead. The corporate office had shut down the power to the floor's utility line. We take the stairs, I said. We had just reached the heavy steel door of the stairwell when the sound of footsteps came from the concrete landing below. Not rushing, just the steady, even rhythm of leather shoes climbing the stairs. Trask froze. He looked at me, his eyes wide, his hand dropping from the door handle. The door swung open from the inside. Stellan Ives stood on the concrete landing, his gray overcoat open, his tie perfectly centered. He was holding a small leather folder under his arm. Behind him, 2 men in standard gray security uniforms stood on the steps, their hands tucked into their belts. No weapons visible, no thriller theatric, just the quiet weight of corporate authority backed by a private contract. Bowen, Ives said, his voice echoing slightly in the concrete stairwell. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, like a headmaster catching a student outside their dorm after hours. You always were unreliable. We paid your relocation expenses in full. We even kept your license active with the state board despite the incident in Boise 3 years ago. You should have stayed in Idaho. Trask didn't answer. He backed up a step, his shoulder hitting the drywall of the corridor. Ives turned his gaze to me. He looked at the blue bin in my arm. Mr. Vance, you're persistent. I'll give you that. Your father was an engineer, wasn't he? You have that same look. The kind of man who thinks if he can just find the broken gear, he can fix the machine. The machine is already broken, Dr. Ives, I said, keeping the bin steady between us. Owen Marsh is going to a federal penitentiary for 20 years. Your subsidiary in Montana is gone. And these files have your signature on the risk mitigation sheets. This isn't an administrative error. It's a felony pattern under the RICO statute. Ives took a pair of thin leather gloves from his pocket and began pulling them on, finger by finger, with meticulous care. RICO requires a conspiracy, Mr. Vance, Ives said softly. Vanguard Care Systems employs 400 people in 3 states. We provide behavioral health services to thousands of patients who have nowhere else to go. If a few facilities utilize aggressive billing practices to offset the cost of non-compensable care, that's a regulatory matter for the board of directors and our legal team. It's not a criminal conspiracy. It's corporate survival. You killed my brother, I said. Your brother was an addict who stole an internal document from an administrative assistant's desk, Ives said. His voice didn't rise a single decibel. He was going to destroy a facility that 40 other patients were relying on for their daily survival. He was a destabilizing element in a fragile ecosystem. I made a clinical decision to manage the risk. The county coroner agreed with my assessment. He nodded to the 2 security guards behind him. Take the bin, please, Mr. Vance is trespassing on private corporate property. His credentials do not apply to this facility. The 2 guards stepped onto the landing. They weren't muscle-bound thugs. They were middle-aged guys who looked like they usually spent their shifts monitoring parking gate receipts or checking badges at a front desk. But they had the weight of the company behind them, and they moved with the dull, methodical purpose of people who just wanted to finish their shift and go home. Don't do it, I told the first guard, a guy with a name tag that read Hensley. This is federal evidence. If you touch this bin, you're obstructing a grand jury investigation. That's 5 years minimum before you even get to the fraud charges. Hensley stopped. He looked at Ives, then back at my ID card, which I had pinned to my breast pocket. The other guard, an older man with gray hair, hesitated too, his boot resting on the top step. Doctor, Ives, Hensley asked, his voice uncertain. Is this a federal audit? It's a disgruntled former employee and a private citizen with an unresolved personal grievance, Ives said. His voice remained perfectly smooth, but his fingers twitched inside the leather glove. The facility is private property. Clear the corridor. I'm Special Auditor Jasper Vance, I said, looking Hensley straight in the eye. My office has been monitoring the IP traffic from this building for 72 hours. If you take this bin, your face is going on a federal warrant by 4 p.m. today. Ask yourself if Vanguard is going to pay your legal fees when the Inspector General's office comes to your house. Hensley looked at his partner. Then he took a step back down the stairs. This isn't what we were called for, Doc. You said it was a clearance issue with an old contractor. It is a clearance issue, Ives said, his voice finally losing its warmth, turning thin and sharp like a razor blade. Get the bin. No, sir, Hensley said, shaking his head. We're going back to the front desk. If the feds are here, you guys can sort it out with the regional manager. The 2 guards turned and walked down the concrete stairs, their heavy boots echoing until the fire door at the bottom clicked shut. The silence returned, larger this time. Trask was still breathing heavily against the wall. Ives stood on the landing alone, his leather folder held tight against his ribs. He looked at me, then down at the blue bin, and finally at the small, square window in the stairwell door that looked out over the gray, rain-slicked runway of the airport a mile away. You think you've won something here, Jasper, Ives said. He didn't sound angry now. He just sounded old. You think if you bring these papers to your supervisor, they'll put my face on a poster, and your brother will somehow be less dead. But that's not how the department works. Vanguard has 3 former federal prosecutors on their retention payroll in Washington. By tomorrow afternoon, your blue bin will be tied up in an administrative stay that will last longer than your career. Maybe, I said, lifting the bin higher against my chest. But you're going to have to spend the rest of today explaining to your board why the OIG is sitting in your archive room. I walked past him onto the landing, Trask following close behind me, his eyes fixed on the floor. Ives didn't move to stop us. He stood by the concrete railing, his leather gloves dark against the gray paint, watching us descend the stairs into the cold, damp dark of the lower levels. We reached the loading dock doors without seeing another soul. The rental car was exactly where I'd left it, its windows fogged from the inside. I threw the blue bin into the trunk, slammed the lid down, and turned to Trask. Go home, Bowen, I said. Stay out of the facility. If Farrow needs you, she knows how to find your P.O. box. Trask didn't say anything. He just nodded once, pulled his hood up against the drizzle, and walked away toward the public transit station at the edge of the park. I got into the driver's seat and turned the key. The radio came on automatically. a local news station talking about a multi-car accident on the interstate 3 miles north. I put the car in gear and drove out of the plaza, my phone still vibrating against the dashboard console with Miller's name flashing on the digital screen. I didn't drive to the federal building downtown. I drove south, toward the river, toward the place where Julian had spent his last night, looking through the trash for the names of the people who were selling his life by the milligram. The evidence was in the trunk. The names were on the paper. But as I watched the gray Oregon landscape blur through the rain, I knew Ives hadn't been completely wrong. The machine was massive, its gears hidden behind 3 layers of corporate shielding and 50 miles of legal brief. I had the files that could start the fire, but the wood was wet, and the people who owned the forest were already writing the press release. I pulled over into a gravel turnout near the water, picked up the phone, and finally slid the green icon across the screen. Miller, I said. There was a long pause on the other end, the sound of papers rustling, and then my supervisor's voice came through, cold and dry as winter grass. Jasper, Miller said, don't come back to Denver. Faro just got a call from the regional director of Vanguard. They're filing for a voluntary corporate restructuring under federal oversight. They've just turned over 3 boxes of encrypted drives from their Portland archive. They're naming Stellan Ives as the sole coordinator of the billing discrepancy. I looked back at the trunk through the rearview mirror. They're giving him up. They're giving him up to save the contract, Miller said. But there's a problem. Ives signed a severance agreement 45 minutes ago. He's currently listed as a private consultant, not an officer of the company. His personal files aren't covered by the corporate surrender. I have the files, I said. The hard copy. The ones with his handwritten notes about Julia. The line went quiet for 5 seconds. When Miller spoke again, his voice was lower, the tone he used when he was talking to an agent whose cover had just been blown in a bad neighborhood. Jasper, look at the signature on the internal incident report you downloaded this morning. The one from Hope Pathway. I reached into the passenger seat, pulled the printed PDF from my coat pocket, and looked down at the neat, precise script at the bottom of the page. It's Ives, I said. No, Miller said quietly. Look at the second name, the one under the risk mitigation note, the corporate compliance officer who approved the relocation expense for Trask. I squinted at the faded blue ink of the digital scan. Underneath Ives' signature, there was another line, written in the same neat, balanced hand, but with a different set of initials. Approved. MRV. My breath hitched. MRV Miller's full name was Miller Richard Vance. He was my father's cousin, the man who had recommended Julian for the program at Hope Pathway 2 years ago, the man who had signed my field assignment to Whispering Pines 6 weeks ago. Jasper, Miller said through the small speaker, his voice perfectly steady, perfectly professional. Come into the local Portland field office. Let's talk about how we're going to frame the final report. I didn't answer. I just reached out and tapped the red icon on the screen. The call disconnected, returning the display to the generic digital clock. I grabbed my Federal issue phone, popped the casing, and pulled the battery. I broke the SIM card in half between my thumbnails and dropped the pieces into the dregs of the cold coffee sitting in the cup holder. Miller, he wasn't just a distant relative who shared a last name. He was the one who drove up to the house when our dad died. He was the one who sat in the living room and told me Julian needed a tough love approach, that the cycle of addiction was going to destroy him if we didn't intervene. He recommended Hope Pathway. He even offered to co-sign the guarantor paperwork, and then he signed the risk mitigation form that allowed a contract orderly to vanish after Julian was murdered. I put the car in drive and pulled back onto the road. The rental sedan was booked through the Treasury travel portal. It had GPS telematics. Miller probably already had a tech in Denver pulling the live location data. I had maybe 20 minutes before the Portland field office dispatched a local unit to intercept me. I drove north, staying exactly at the speed limit, keeping my eyes on the mirrors. I didn't see any black SUVs or flashing lights, just the steady, gray flow of Oregon traffic. I pulled into the parking garage of a large outdoor shopping mall in Tigard. I parked on the 3rd level, next to a concrete pillar, away from the security cameras. Inside the mall, I found an outdoor recreation store. I paid cash for a heavy, water-resistant canvas duffel bag and a cheap prepaid cell phone. Back in the parking garage, I opened the trunk of the rental. I transferred the contents of the blue bin into the duffel bag, stacking the manila folders and billing printouts tight so they wouldn't shift. The bag weighed over 60 pounds. I left the empty blue bin in the trunk, tossed the rental keys onto the driver's seat, and walked away. I caught a city bus heading downtown, rode it for 40 minutes, and then switched to the light rail. The rain was coming down harder now, washing the city in a cold, metallic blur. I got off near an industrial district on the east side of the river and walked 3 blocks to a motel with a neon sign that buzzed like a dying hornet. I paid for 2 nights with cash under the name Thomas Locke. The room smelled of stale cigarettes and cheap pine cleaner. The carpet was a dark, unidentifiable pattern meant to hide stains. I locked the deadbolt, pulled the heavy blackout curtains shut, and dumped the contents of the duffel bag onto the sagging mattress. I needed to understand exactly what I was holding. If I was going to burn my career, my supervisor, and my own family, I needed the fire to be absolute. I spent the next 4 hours cross-referencing the ledger Trask had given me with the internal emails from Vanguard Care System. I organized the paperwork into 3 separate piles on the bedspread. The first pile was the dummy pharmacy network. Stellan Ives and his regional managers were writing hundreds of prescriptions a month for heavy antipsychotics and sedatives, billing Medicare and private insurance. But the pills were never delivered to the facility. They were rerouted to a wholesale buyer in Washington state. The cash from that buyer was funneled back into Vanguard through a series of shell consulting firms. The second pile was the patient logs, the kids who were supposed to be getting those medications. The ones Vanguard claimed were receiving cutting-edge psychiatric care were instead being kept compliant with massive, illegal doses of cheap paralytics and sedatives bought under the table. That was the sponge trick I'd pulled in Montana. That's why Julian died. He found out they were faking the inventory. The third pile was the protection. I found Miller's fingerprints everywhere, buried under layers of bureaucratic oversight. Whenever a state inspector flagged one of Vanguard's facilities for high mortality rates or unusual billing spikes, Miller's office at the OIG would intercept the referral. He would launch an internal federal audit that effectively froze the state's jurisdiction. The federal audit would drag on for 18 months, find a few minor administrative errors, levy a small fine, and close the case. Miller wasn't just taking bribes. He was Vanguard's shield. He was using the authority of the federal government to run interference for a drug diversion ring. And for his trouble, a Delaware LLC registered to his wife's maiden name had received quarterly deposits of $45,000 for compliance consulting. I sat back in the cheap plastic chair by the window, rubbing my eyes. My hands smelled like old dust and printer ink. I couldn't go to Faro. She might be a straight arrow, but any evidence I handed her would have to be logged into the OIG database. Miller would see it. He'd have it sequestered under national security or ongoing criminal enterprise protocols, and then I'd be arrested for stealing federal evidence and violating the terms of an active investigation. The files would disappear. I needed an external mechanism, someone who didn't care about the OIG's internal politics. I opened the packaging of the prepaid phone, activated it, and dialed a number I hadn't called in 4 years. It rang 5 times before going to a dry, professional voicemail greeting. "You've reached the office of Sable Wolf. Leave a message." Sable was an assistant United States attorney in the Southern District of New York. We had worked a massive Medicare fraud case together when I was just starting out as a senior auditor. She was ruthless, brilliant, and deeply unpopular with her superiors because she didn't know how to compromise. More importantly, she had an active, vocal hatred for Miller, who had once tried to tank one of her indictments to protect a political appointee. I didn't leave a message. I sent a text message instead. "It's Van. I have 50 pages of hard evidence proving a regional OIG director is actively shielding a multi-state RICO enterprise. Need a secure drop. I'm off the grid." I set the phone down on the bedside table. I didn't know if she would reply. It was a massive risk. If she reported the text through official channels, I'd have U.S. Marshals at the door by midnight. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The neon sign outside flickered, casting a sickly red glow through the gap in the curtains. The burner phone buzzed against the cheap laminate wood. I picked it up. A new message from an unknown number. "If this is a joke, I will personally ruin you. If it's real, don't use this number again. Go to the public library in downtown Portland tomorrow at 10:00 a.m. Use the public terminal. Email the scanned ledger pages to the encrypted address below. Do not include your location." A complex Proton mail address followed. I let out a slow breath. I had a lifeline, but I needed digital copy. I couldn't walk into a public library with 60 pounds of paper. I looked around the dingy motel room. There was no scanner, no business center, just a broken ice machine down the hall. I grabbed my coat and headed back out into the rain. I walked half a mile to an all-night copy and print shop, nestled between a liquor store and a pawn shop. The kid working the counter was wearing large headphones and didn't even look up as I swiped my personal credit card to rent a high-speed scanning terminal in the back corner. It was a risk using my own card, but I needed speed, and cash wasn't an option for the machine rental. For the next 3 hours, I stood under the harsh fluorescent lights, feeding page after page through the autofeeder. Every ledger, every internal memo, every risk mitigation sheet with Miller's initials. I saved everything onto a pair of encrypted flash drives. By the time I finished, it was nearly 3 a.m. My back ached, and my eyes felt like they were filled with sand. I bought a black coffee from a convenience store across the street and walked back to the motel. When I opened the door, the room was exactly as I had left it. The physical files were still spread across the bed. I sat down on the edge of the mattress and pulled out the burner phone. There was one more thing I had to do. It was reckless, and it violated every protocol I had ever been taught, but I needed Miller to know that the game was out of his control. I needed him to panic, because panicked men call their lawyers, and lawyers leave digital trails. I took a photo of the risk mitigation document, the one bearing his initials authorizing the orderly's payout after Julian's death. I made sure the lighting was clear, the ink easily readable. I typed in Miller's direct personal number, the one he only used for family. I attached the photo and typed a single line of text. "I'm not coming to the office, Richard. We're going to talk about Julian." I hit send, then immediately powered the phone down and pulled the battery. I lay back on the pillows, fully dressed, the smell of damp wool and old paper surrounding me. I didn't expect to sleep. My mind was racing, plotting the route to the library, anticipating the counter moves Vanguard's fixers would try to deploy once Sable dropped the hammer from New York. But exhaustion is a heavy blanket. Somewhere around 5:00 a.m., the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the window pulled me under. I woke up abruptly. The room was still dark, but the red neon light from the sign outside was no longer flickering through the gap in the curtain. It was blocked. Someone was standing outside the window, directly on the other side of the glass. I froze. I didn't reach for my coat or the duffel bag. I just stayed perfectly still, breathing through my nose. A quiet, rhythmic tapping started on the glass. Not a threat, a signal. 3 short taps, a pause, then 2 more. It was the federal field knock for a plainclothes contact. I slid off the bed, keeping my weight off the noisy spring, and moved to the edge of the window. I pulled the curtain back just half an inch. Standing in the rain, wearing a dark raincoat with the hood pulled down, was Agent Arlo Farrow. She was alone. Her hands were visible, resting casually on the strap of a leather messenger bag across her chest. She looked directly at the sliver of space where I was watching her. "Open the door, Jasper," she said. Her voice was muffled by the glass, but the sharp, restless tone was unmistakable. "I didn't bring the cavalry, and you know Miller is tracking your credit card hits. You have about 12 minutes before the people he hired to clean this up get to the copy shop down the street." I didn't hesitate. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy door open just enough for her to slip through. Farrow stepped inside, shaking the water from her raincoat onto the stained carpet. She didn't look at the sagging bed or the peeling wallpaper. Her sharp eyes immediately found the 2 encrypted flash drives sitting on the nightstand next to the burner phone. "Sable Wolf called me," Farrow said, her voice low and rapid. 4 minutes after you sent that text to New York. Sable doesn't trust anyone in the Portland field office, but she knows I've been quietly trying to pull Miller's financial disclosures for the last 6 months. She told me to find you before he did." I looked at her, the exhaustion temporarily burned away by the adrenaline. "You've been investigating Miller?" "I'm OIG," Farrow said, stepping over to the window and peering through the narrow gap in the curtains. "My job is finding the rot inside the house." Miller's case closure rates on Vanguard facilities were statistically impossible. I knew he was burying something, but I didn't have the physical ledger. I didn't have the internal routing numbers. She turned to look at me. "Do you have them?" "I have everything," I said. "Every dummy prescription, every diverted payment, and the risk mitigation sheet with Miller's initials authorizing the payoff for the orderly who watched my brother die." "Pack the paper," Farrow ordered. "Leave the burner phone. We're leaving through the bathroom window. It opens out into the alley behind the liquor store." I grabbed the heavy canvas duffel bag and started shoving the manila folders and billing printouts inside. I didn't bother organizing them. I grabbed the 2 flash drives, slid them into my front pocket, and tossed the prepaid cell phone onto the mattress. We moved fast. Farrow popped the screen off the small frosted window in the bathroom. The alley smelled of wet garbage and diesel exhaust. I went first, dropping the heavy duffel bag into a puddle before pulling myself over the sill. Farrow followed, landing lightly on the cracked asphalt. We didn't run. Running attracts attention. We walked at a brisk, purposeful pace down the alley, keeping to the shadows of the brick walls. As we reached the cross street, I glanced back toward the front of the motel. A dark gray SUV with tinted windows had just pulled into the lot. 2 men in plain dark jackets got out. They didn't look like federal agents. They moved with the quiet, brutal efficiency of private contractors who were paid by the hour to make corporate liabilities disappear. The machine was trying to clean up its mess. They were 4 minutes too late. Farrow's vehicle, a nondescript silver sedan, was parked 2 blocks away under a flickering street lamp. We threw the duffel bag into the trunk and got inside. Farrow started the engine, kept the headlights off, and pulled smoothly away from the curb, blending into the early morning commercial traffic heading toward the interstate. Once we were over the bridge and out of the immediate grid, Farrow reached into her messenger bag, pulled out a heavy rubberized satellite phone, and plugged it into the dashboard console. She hit a single speed dial button and put it on speaker. It rang twice. "Tell me you have him," a woman's voice said through the static. It was dry, sharp, An unmistakably Sable wolf. I have it, Pharaoh said, keeping her eyes on the wet road. And I have the drive. Vance, Sable said, the audio crackling slightly. You always were a dramatic pain in my ass. I told you to go to a public library, not start a war with a regional director. Miller forced the timeline, I said, watching the gray city blur past the passenger window. He sent private security to my motel. If I waited until 10:00 am, the drives would be at the bottom of the Willamette River. It doesn't matter now, Sable replied, her tone shifting into pure operational coldness. I bypassed the OIG and went straight to the DOJ's public integrity section. I woke up a federal judge 20 minutes ago. We have the warrants. For Vanguard? I asked. For everything, Sable said. The FBI's anti-corruption unit is breaching Vanguard's corporate headquarters in Seattle right now. They're locking down the servers before Ives' people can run the scrubbers. And Ives, arrested at Portland International 10 minutes ago, Sable said. He was sitting in the first-class lounge waiting for a flight to Vancouver. He had a briefcase full of bearer bonds and a laptop he tried to smash against a marble pillar when the agents approached him. He's in custody. I leaned my head back against the cold window glass. The tight, suffocating knot that had been sitting in my chest since Whispering Pines began to loosen. What about Miller? There was a brief pause on the line. I could hear the faint sound of a siren through Pharaoh's speaker. Miller's house in Denver was raided at 5:15 am, Sable said quietly. He didn't run. He was sitting at his kitchen table in his suit, waiting for them. He tried to claim he was conducting a classified internal audit and that his signature was forged. But we have his bank records now. Jasper, the shell company in Delaware, the quarterly deposits. The money trail connects him directly to the diverted pharmaceuticals. He's looking at 20 years for the RICO charges alone, and that's before we even touch the accessory to murder for your brother. I closed my eyes. Thank you, Sable. Don't thank me yet, she said. You're going to spend the next 2 weeks sitting in a windowless room in New York, giving depositions to a grand jury. But it's over, Van. You got them. The line clicked dead. Pharaoh reached out and turned off the satellite phone. The car was quiet, save for the rhythmic slapping of the windshield wipers pushing the Oregon rain away. The sky to the east was finally starting to lighten, turning from a bruised black to a pale, washed-out gray. Where are we going? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The federal courthouse downtown, Pharaoh said. Sable arranged a secure handoff. We walked the physical files right into the U.S. Attorney's secure vault, signed the chain of custody, and then I buy you the strongest cup of coffee in the city. I looked down at my hand. They were steady. The phantom tremors I had faked in the Montana psychiatric ward were entirely gone. For 18 months, I had carried the weight of Julian's death, letting the lie of his overdose harden into a heavy, unmovable stone. I had believed the system was simply indifferent, that he had slipped through the cracks of an overwhelmed medical infrastructure. I hadn't realized the cracks were intentionally carved, designed to swallow people whole, so men like Ives and Miller could profit off the silence. They had built a perfect machine. They had layered it with corporate shielding, hidden it behind medical jargon, and guarded it with federal badges. But machines only work if no one looks closely at the gears. Julian had looked. He had paid for it with his life, but he had left the map behind in the trash. And now, the whole massive predatory structure was coming apart. Pharaoh pulled the sedan into the underground parking garage of the federal courthouse. The heavy steel security gate rolled up, allowing us into the brightly lit concrete cavern. 2 armed federal marshals were standing by the secure elevator, waiting for us. I reached into the back seat and grabbed the heavy canvas duffel bag. It weighed a ton, but as I stepped out of the car and walked toward the light of the elevator, it felt lighter than it had in days. The machine was broken, and for the first time in a year and a half, Julian could finally rest.